to start off, I just want to give a brief overview of the Palestinian refugee situation and the intersection between that and education in this part of the world. Learning for the Empowerment and Advancement of Palestinians is the program that Dima and I and all the volunteers up here are part of. The Palestinian refugee problem is the largest and longest lasting refugee crisis in the world. And unlike other Arab host states, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are almost entirely dependent on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency as their main relief, as well as their major employer due to restrictions in every part of their lives. Education is the most successful means to break through this paradigm that's been created and to really attain a different level of self-sufficiency through employment. A couple of statistics that are important to remember. 750,000 Palestinians became refugees when exiled during the Nakba from 1947 to 1949, and then another 350,000 Palestinians were exiled during the Six-Day War in 1967. 40% of the world's refugees today are Palestinian, and 74% of the total Palestinian population today are refugees. When discussing the hardships that Palestinian refugees face, it's important to remember that Palestinians comprise nearly 10% of Lebanon's population, yet they remain subject to arbitrary restrictions to employment and education. They're prohibited from working in over 70 professions, causing a 56% unemployment rate amongst the refugee population. They're denied legal and social services. And the services that are provided to them through UNRWA are limited and inadequate. Samantha is actually going to fill us in about that. Along with these injustices, the systemic issues that they face, Palestinian refugees also face humiliation and discrimination. They're denied citizenship, representation, and property ownership. So what's the reality on the ground? Palestinian refugees are denied access to public schools. And because UNRWA is the sole provider for education to Palestinian refugees, they're faced with limited and inadequate services. 40% of the Palestinian refugee youth complete primary school, 5% complete middle school, 5% hold a university degree. 66% of Palestinian students do not have the brevet exam, and therefore they are unable to be promoted to high school and go on with higher education. This obviously has intense and severe consequences for both unemployment and food security, as well as other types of instability. We all know that education increases employment opportunities, but this is most intensely displayed in the Palestinian refugee context. Education and employment are two of the largest obstacles faced by Palestinian refugees. Passing the brevet and baccalaureate respectively increases access to further educational opportunities and increases the chances of gaining sustainable employment and becoming productive members of society. Over 45% of Palestinians drop out before high school, and this is primarily because the brevet national exam is administered in English. Without a grasp of the English language, Palestinian refugees are constantly left behind. 70% of Palestinian refugee youth are unemployed, and this is one of the reasons why learning for the empowerment and advancement of Palestinians became a reality. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that.
So, in discussing the importance of education for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, it's important to note that English proficiency, as Shaffer just stated, is necessary for educational advancement into high school and university. And in order to gain promotion to high school or attend vocational schools, Palestinians must pass the National Brevet exam, which are all administered in English. And that's why LEAP's English projects work to provide productive spaces for youth during their summers and after school to strengthen their English proficiency. LEAP is an educational enrichment program for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, which aims to nurture students' intellectual growth and creative curiosity so they become agents of change. LEAP is also a grassroots, volunteer-run and operated program with no paid staff or administrators. We operate with our board of directors, our advisory board, and an amazing team of dedicated volunteers, and some of which you'll hear from shortly. And all LEAP efforts are a labor of love and commitment to the rights of refugees, and particularly the empowering right to education for all children. LEAP has 6 main objectives. First, it's to provide a safe and productive space for youth, both during the summer and after school. Second, to decrease dropout rates and increase promotion to high school. Third, to re-inspire a thirst for knowledge in and outside of the classroom. Fourth, to help provide access to greater educational services and opportunities. Fifth, to expose refugee students, often isolated, to volunteers from other cultures, languages, and parts of the world. And sixth, to develop a global mission, a global community of conscientious individuals who are committed to LEAP's mission. So in short, basically, the LEAP mission is twofold. Our volunteers teach to empower refugee youth and are simultaneously empowered to raise awareness within their home communities about the plight of Palestinian refugees. And LEAP has 3 main projects. We have the SHINE Summer Help in English program, which launched in 2010. ASPIRE, which is the after-school project in remedial English, and the pilot program launched in the spring of 2012 for year-long support. And RISE, which is Recruitment Initiative for Scholarship Enrollment, which began in the spring of 2012. In looking at the progress and achievements of LEAP, it has become apparent that LEAP has grown exponentially since its inception for 2 reasons. First, volunteers witness firsthand the profound impact they have on their students. And second, the Palestinian camp community acknowledges the benefits of LEAP's projects. And the community welcomes us to return and requests for us to expand and increase our services and opportunities. In 2010, LEAP started with 7 volunteers who worked in 1 camp with 150 students. And this past summer of 2013, LEAP had 100 accepted volunteers, and we were set to work in 5 camps, reaching over 1,000 students and 150 teachers. But due to the security situation in Lebanon, we were forced to cancel the program and have an abridged version, where we had 27 volunteers working in 2 camps with 450 students and 30 teachers. In terms of our impact, LEAP started with 1 project in 2010 and now operates 4 projects. We train both students and teachers and have begun implementing community development projects. LEAP has attracted a total of 180 volunteers and reached over 2,000 refugee students. And over 50% of the volunteer return rate demonstrates the commitment to refugee rights and right to education for Palestinian refugee youth. And over 85% student return rate demonstrates the benefits and enjoyment by students. And now we're going to hear from our LEAP volunteers.
As they mentioned earlier, the political situation in Lebanon is basically affecting the refugees in that they do not have the same political and civil rights as other people who are citizens in any country. They don't have access to the same opportunities for education and employment. The internal situation is that their community is living in very deep poverty as compared with their surroundings in Lebanon. Basically, living in the camp means that they don't have access to the same kind of municipal services that includes like emergency services, hospitals, healthcare. So not only are they living in poverty, there are a lot of different stressful conditions that students are facing when they're living in the camps in Lebanon. So I mentioned violence is one of the things that basically there's not a lot of order in the camp because there's no proper government. So when they don't have, access to emergency services, if there is a situation in the camp, people basically do not feel safe. That's something that adds to the stress that students are dealing with in the camps. There's a lot of different public health issues going on. We'll talk about that in another slide. And there's basically overcrowding everywhere in the camps. Because there was only 1 square kilometer of space allocated to the camps when they were, conceived in 1948, and the population has been growing ever since, so they've had to build up. So there is big problems with overcrowding in housing, schools. There are no spaces for playgrounds, students to play, etc. The UNRWA education system we touched on a little earlier is lacking a lot of resources. So basically in reality what that looks like for students is that classrooms are disorganized, they're overcrowded, they're not very well equipped. Maybe teachers don't always have the proper training, and this leads to a lot of behavioral problems going on in classrooms. And that takes away a lot from their motivation to learn. Not only are they restricted from many different professions, but the environment in classrooms makes it, a lot more difficult for them. And the overall environment in the camps pressures them to mature early. So that does add to the dropout rate. I think the average dropout rate for students is 15. They drop out of school. I mean, I guess it all fits in with this, that it's a stressful environment. There's pressure to mature early for them. We're going to look at this is a picture. This was the view from our balcony in the camp. So as you can see, there are very few open spaces, and this is a spot where people were, beginning to dump garbage because there are no municipal services like sanitation. And also on the far left corner, they began building a schoolyard, or actually a playground with like a swing set last year, because basically there are no open public spaces for playgrounds for students to play and things like that. So they started building it like right behind that car. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on the public health issues that are going on. This is in Burj al-Barajna in Beirut. This is kind of what most of the walkways look like. There are tons of wires and water pipes mixed up that go overhead. There's not a lot of sunlight that permeates to the bottom because they are forced to build up. So a lot of times the ground is wet from people washing, I guess, their floors and whatnot. So it stays like that for a while. And like I said, sanitation, the electricity and wires can be very dangerous when it rains. People can get electrocuted. And then there's limited access to healthcare. So for instance, in Burj al-Barajna, there was only one hospital serving 16,000 residents. This is another scene from the camp. So these are water pipes. The water is not exactly treated. It's fit for certain things. It's not necessarily fit for bathing or drinking. It's kind of hard water, so it's a bit salty because they are not hooked up to the main Lebanese water system. So these are all conditions that we had to deal with when we were living there for 1 month, but for the rest of the residents of the camps, including the students, these are what they're living with every day. Also, I don't know if I mentioned the electricity cutting off really frequently, maybe up to 10 times a day, and that's very distracting in the classroom. Especially, I was in a basement with no windows, so it would cut off a few times, and we had, I guess, battery charged lights, but, sometimes class we could not conduct, or it was just, from the heat, the darkness, it was some very distracting conditions for us teaching and for the students also. This is another scene from a walkway. I guess the buildings, they're high up, so a lot of the walkways are shadowed. And to come back to how students are living, there are boundaries for the youth in the camps. They're dealing with social and spatial boundaries. So the spatial ones are basically what's dividing the camp from the rest of Beirut or the rest of Lebanon. The social boundaries are kind of the discrimination that Palestinians face when living in Lebanon, kind of the taboo around forming relationships with Palestinians in Lebanon or Lebanese citizens. The taboo in that, the fear about it, or the stigma of the unknown, or what's going on in there, or in these, underprivileged communities that they don't deem to be safe. They wouldn't go into it, or, things like that. So, and furthermore, there are not a lot of opportunities for Palestinians to integrate into Lebanese society. There's limited opportunities for work, employment, housing. So basically, how are the youth relating to regular Lebanese youth? They're mostly not. They're not exposed to them a whole lot. So I think another reason that our presence is important is because we as foreigners are relating to them and are communicating with them and making them feel not so isolated. And also, we as guests in the community, we did feel welcome, especially by students, teachers, and parents. The response was really overwhelming. Not everyone in the community was. Some people were definitely skeptical to us as foreigners, to us as people of privilege coming into the community to teach and volunteer. But I would say the response from the students was overwhelming. That really made it worth it for us. And yeah, just to leave you with some pictures, this is an art mural we did in Burj al-Barajna, the one on top, with our art class, because in addition to English, there's recreation classes. So that's one of the murals we did. We combined the themes of the sea, because some students wanted to paint, I guess, some fish in the sea, and to combine it with the saying, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And these are some pictures of us in the river and my class. So I would say it's really gratifying, honestly, teaching these students. We did not want to leave. For all the hardships we had to put up with for 1 month, I mean, we were all crying when we said goodbye to them. There was no experience that could have replaced it for me. That's all.
Okay, hi guys. My name is Asif, and back from my first time doing LEAP this summer. A small little note. This time last year, I actually was in the same seat you were sitting in right now, because I learned about LEAP at the NYU event, and I learned a lot, and from there I ended up going in the summer. Hopefully by now some of you guys are interested in partaking in LEAP. I think it's a great program, and if you are, I just want to give you a good example and exposure of what a daily day would be. Okay, this is better. Is this better? All right. So I just want to give you an example of what a daily day would be, going through a schedule of a day, from working to being in the classroom to trying to grade homeworks, tests, etc. First of all, first thing we do, probably wake up around 8ish. For me, probably around 9ish, but 8ish is probably a good mark to be there, just because usually we would try to meet at the school before class around 9:15, which Dima notes ended up being 9:45 later on. From there, we would have our first class, and everyone was divided into different levels, either between pre-beginner, beginner, intermediate, and advanced, depending on their proficiency in English to begin with. From there, we would have an activity. I know Samantha touched upon it a little bit. She showed you the mural. That's actually one of the activities that we did. My activity was theater, so my kids, we ended up putting a play at the end of the course, which was fantastic. The kids loved it. The parents loved it. So there's definitely opportunities to, not only teach them in English, but, take out, their artistic abilities, and, actually find out what, they really want to say, and trying to, expose that through art. From there, we would have an hour lunch break. I say lunch break, so I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with the area. It's primarily a Muslim. It's an Islamic state, so a lot of the people would be fasting during the month of Ramadan. I know I was. So say lunch break, but you're pretty much fasting the whole day. And actually, a really cool thing was a lot of people that, by faith didn't have to fast ended up fasting with us in solidarity, which is pretty awesome. From there, it says class/community project. Originally, we were just supposed to have community project, because every year we have a community project. This year was a dental hygiene initiative, where we would try to expose good dental hygiene practices, brushing your teeth, what happens if you don't, try to cut down on sweets, etc. Second class, then 5 o'clock, class cuts out. We have free time, pretty much. I say free time, pretty much everyone went home to sleep for a little while, because the day was pretty exhausting. At that time, iftar, what I mean by iftar, that's the time that we would be breaking fast, so we'd all probably pretty much come together, eat together, and then 12 o'clock should be bedtime. I probably wasn't asleep at 12, but we definitely should be in the house, prepping for the next day. Specifically, I'm here, I want to talk about just the class part. Can I just get a show of hands? How many people have taught young kids before? Okay, well, that's a lot. Last year, I didn't raise my hand for that question, because I had no experience teaching kids. And honestly, if you don't feel deterred. You do not need any sort of educational background or teaching background to be a good teacher here. Year long we have a curriculum that professors, teachers are looking at every single step of the way, and they're just continuously reworking it, so you can go step by step from the curriculum if you'd like to. If you can stray away from that a little bit if you want to, but curriculum is there in place. I honestly think other than teaching skills, the two things you really need with these kids is compassion and patience. And I'm going to stress the patience part because these kids, they're a handful, at least mine were. So more with the classroom, I just want to show you a little graphic. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I don't know if you can read the captions. I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's a little bit of a comparison between my office where I work in New York City and the classroom I had in Sur, which is in southern Lebanon.
Those are nicer tables.
Honestly, I was just about to say that. It was a consensus that I had the best classroom in the whole building, and that's including, you know, crowded tables because, you know, we overfilled the classroom. Honestly, you can see the one on the right. It says that table was going to be broken because just kids would just want to sit on it. You know, the fan wouldn't work half the day. It was extremely hot. You know, as compared to, you know, here, you know, where at my office there's more computers than employees. You know the TV works, and honestly, over there we're doing so much work. Here I can actually have some downtime. You can see I'm just chilling on ESPN right there. So definitely some downtime indeed. So just, you know, a little example. Patience with the kids. Just honestly, the kids really make up the program. Honestly, when I went there, I thought I'd be going there for more of a cultural exposure, more of like a trip to see Lebanon. I wanted to see Lebanon, and I did, and we actually did end up going on a few trips that were great. But by the end of it, the sole purpose of being there was just, you know, for the kids, and that I really feel like I impacted their lives, which was, you know, a great feeling. Just one thing, just you really have to think on your feet for a lot of situations because they can get a little rowdy. I know, especially me, you know, they would call me a foreigner. I don't know Arabic well, so I would actually have a volunteer with me translating, and you know, they're just getting riled up. They're hot, you know. You're getting riled up, you're anxious, you just want to get out of class as much as they do. So you do have to think on your feet a little bit. I know I did. Every so often you kind of would just hear my kids like filed out of the hallway. We'd go down towards like the lobby area where I just kind of play games with them. I kind of introduced them to duck, duck, goose. In Arabic, they called it batta, batta, wasa, which is the little translation. And the kids, they loved it. So like, as long as you're, you know, friendly with them, you kind of like open with them, you know, as long as they know that you're there to help them out, you know, they'll definitely react in the same way. And so as much as you give to them, they'll give back. So honestly, guys, great experience. I would do it again if I can. I'm probably going to actually. So definitely, it's something you guys should definitely think about. And I hope you enjoy it when you go. Thanks.
Okay, so I was tasked with talking about this sort of hodgepodge of identity and the schools and the camps and the diaspora, and so I'm not particularly sure what this turned out to be. So, you know, I hope it makes sense to you in some way. I think that talking about and framing the Palestinian refugee experience or Palestinian identity in any context is really very difficult for two reasons. All right. Both the idea that there even is a Palestinian refugee experience, a single one, or one identity. That's one sort of difficulty. And then secondly, a tendency that stems from those ideas to either fully accept that a single narrative does or should exist, or the complete opposite, which is to over-compartmentalize the diversity of those narratives to a degree that ignores the common threads between all of the Palestinian refugee communities. The reality, I think, is somewhere in the middle, that there are multiple narratives and identities and experiences that make up the larger Palestinian story, but there are points of relation and connection that haven't dissipated between different localities. Now, clearly not every Palestinian is a refugee. There are Palestinians still living in their villages and cities, and though living under occupation are not refugees, or Palestinians living in exile that can't return for political or economic reasons. However, I just want to tell a short but personal story that is also a bit of a confession, so don't be too harsh on me. And it'll, I hope, give a little insight on the impact of this concept of refugee status and what it can have on a developing identity and political and social conceptions of a person's community. I think it actually wasn't until I was around 9 and went to Palestine for the first time, to Gaza specifically, that I actually realized that everyone wasn't a refugee. our story, my family story, was very simple, sort of growing up. We were from this village, we were from Istud, and we were expelled from Istud, and we went to Gaza, to the refugee camps there, and a majority of my family either still lived in Gaza or lived in the Arab world as refugees without any sort of documentation. And everyone who wasn't in Rafah or Deir al-Balah in the Gaza Strip couldn't go back to Istud. So the story was, from Istud, can't go back to Istud. That was the Palestinian story. And so the first time I went to Gaza, I was playing soccer in an alleyway in Rafah, and a young boy who was playing soccer with us, I asked him where he was from, and he said he was from Jerusalem. And I said, okay, but where do you live now? And he said, I live in Jerusalem. And I didn't skip a beat. I said, oh, so there are refugee camps in Jerusalem too? And he said, no, we live in the same city the same house we've always lived in the old city, and I'm just here for the weekend because my mom is from Khan Yunis and she's visiting my uncle. And so, as if to salvage sort of the logic in my head, I said, so your mom's the refugee then, because one parent simply had to be a refugee, or it didn't make sense in my head, from the Khan Yunis camp. And I swear to God, this poor kid probably wanted to throw his soccer shoe at me. He said, well, like, no, she's not from the camp, she's from Khan Yunis. No one in the family are refugees. And so I sighed and sort of quit, and I went home all defeated. And I walked through the door, and my mother was, what happened? Did you lose the game? Why are you so upset? And I looked up at her in what my mother now calls dramatic Nour fashion, and I said, I can't tell who the Palestinians are anymore. I can't make sense of this place. And she, after laughing hysterically for about 10 minutes and telling me that, it was basically pretty easy to figure out who the Palestinians were, it was the people who weren't at the checkpoint pointing guns at you, asked me, well, what in God's name I was talking about. And so I explained about the boy from Jerusalem and the soccer game, and she smiled and reminded me what I already knew about the occupation and helped me connect the dots between my family story and the larger community and all of that. But the point of the story is all to say that a personal identification with or as a refugee supersedes the physical presence of being in a camp or growing up in a camp. And that, yes, even travel documentation and citizenship don't sort of wash that identity away. And that's definitely not to say that those things are not integral components in how we have to understand different scenarios of different, Palestinian refugee communities, but it is to insist that we have to expand our conceptions of the diversity of experiences that make up Palestinian identity. The preservation and recognition of Palestinian identity in a place like Shatila, for example, goes far beyond the markers and binary of living in a camp or living in Palestine, not in a camp. Markers of Palestinianness, quote unquote, and points of pride extend to dialect, to foods, to music, proverbs, and familiarity with a political goal of liberation and return. Whether you say bandora or banadora in the camp when you order your breakfast, if you put sage in your tea in the winter, if you've memorized all the words to certain Dabka songs, how carefully you listen to your grandfather's stories, and how quick you are to name the village or villages that your family is from as opposed to the main urban center in Palestine, and how quick you are to know what it means when someone points to a dilapidated building and gives you a certain date as a marker for what happened to it. I don't mean that these are sort of used as tests of value or tests at all, but that being Palestinian for refugees, even in the camps, is understood in a more nuanced way than the physical obstacles imposed on the refugee experience in parts of the Arab world. In Lebanon, for me as a Palestinian American LEAP volunteer in Shatila, the shocks of the experience came not from the statelessness of the community I was living in, or even the challenges of education, which for me, having had some teaching experience in the States, could have easily been compared with a lot of inner city situations here in the US. But instead, it was really trying to maintain composure amidst the back and forth between the camp and sort of proper Beirut. While it was very much a physical manifestation of the situation Palestinians in Lebanon face, it was also much more than that. I personally had no capacity. I could not contain or process the shock of being in a cramped and hot, technology-absent camp, and then simply standing at the boardwalk 5 minutes later after a cab ride in the city, I had no sense of what it must mean to not only witness the disparity, but to live it daily, fully aware of what was only a few minutes away. And that's just it, right? Is these kids that are up here on the slideshow, they are fully aware of the disparity. They understand the abnormality of the condition, and as a teacher, they will make sure you know that they know, and they will challenge you with that knowledge. When we told the students that their photographs would make it to an exhibit in DC, or that we were putting their movie on YouTube, that they could choose what they wanted to photograph or show people, or that they could write a script about anything that they wanted, their choices never failed to surprise us. Sometimes typical shots of famous spots, right? So they took a shot, for example, of the cemetery of the Shatila massacre or the old PLO headquarters. But sometimes things none of the teachers could figure out why. Seeds, like just a thing of seeds and cords. And then you discovered what was going on in the caption. The picture isn't of the seeds, but it's of the trash under the cart, which is collected by the man selling the seeds, who takes it into the city and sells the trash to the landfill to be able to feed his family. The cords are about how they created a fictional story, about how ones cross over and steal electricity, but the red ones steal the electricity back. And the movie you've built up in your head as some epic expression of struggle about Handala was actually all about getting to get out of class early for a group trip to the beach for an afternoon because they wanted to taste salt in water that didn't come out of the shower head. The most important lesson I learned in a class once was we were doing, one of the things in the curriculum was the Ruby Bridges story. So the African American school, and we're talking about the concepts of segregation and inequality and these kind of things. And suddenly in the middle of class, one of the students, gets up and pounds his fist on the desk and says, "No, I will tell you what's not fair. What's not fair is that this room," there were two classes in one sort of big massive space because that's how we had to have it set up, "is that the room is hot for everybody and that class gets a fan and we don't get a fan, and that's not fair." And I said, okay, touche, but you have to share the fan. So I think for me it became clear that the job not only of teaching but of giving voice to the students, it's about letting them challenge you with the disparity, and it's encouraging them to tell the story themselves. Because in the process of doing so, they inevitably discover another part of the larger story. And sort of more than the cliche, the students teach you something, they actually teach you how to teach. And they teach you how to talk about things that you didn't think that you could find words for. And so that was, for me, that was sort of the most enriching part of the experience. That's my
Thank you for all being here. I just want to start by saying that it was wonderful and incredible to hear from the LEAP volunteers and the LEAP coordinators. One of my formative experiences was actually doing something very similar in 2002, working at Al-Baddawi in Trablus, Lebanon, with something called Cairo to Camps that was housed at the American University in Cairo, where I got to participate. One of the most formative experiences that I've had. I also taught theater. We didn't get to do a play. I wasn't as good as you. But I do encourage those of you who are in the room who are thinking about doing something like this to take advantage of the LEAP program and to be involved in that way. What the narrative that we saw here was one very much a very prototypical, despite Nour's very illuminating discussion about, cautioning us not to oversimplify or overcomplicate the Palestinian refugee experience. What we saw here was only one lens of it, which is about the Palestinian refugee experience, the exiles from 1948 who fled Palestine into Lebanon, who have since become refugees in Lebanon as well as stateless persons in Lebanon because of their protracted refugee situation. where they are not afforded the right of return into their homes and their original lands, their homes where they were originally displaced from, nor are they afforded any kind of durable solutions, including integration into Lebanon or resettlement elsewhere. And that's a condition that's very unique to the Palestinians. They're not the only protracted refugee population, but they certainly are the longest standing one. And so the experience that we see in Lebanon is one which exemplifies the narrative of exile, the desire to return, the prohibition of return because of the risk that Palestinians as a population present to Israel because of a desire to maintain an unnatural demographic balance whereby a Jewish population constitutes a majority within Israel. Right? This is the quintessential Palestinian refugee narrative, if there is to be one, especially, and it's compounded by the awful conditions within Lebanon, which are not the same. For example, elsewhere, Palestinian refugees in Syria and in Jordan have enjoyed, well, Syria up until March 2011, but certainly up until then enjoyed all the rights that Syrian nationals enjoyed, minus the right to vote, which, if you know anything about Syria, doesn't mean much anyway, right? And in Jordan, where they've been afforded citizenship while not relinquishing their right to return to their original homelands. And so it's also, even the Palestinians in exile have a very differentiated experience. The purpose of my discussion is to complicate this a little bit further, to say that when we speak about the Palestinian refugees, and particularly when we speak about the Nakba, or the catastrophe that marked the forced removal, displacement, and dispossession of Palestinians in May 1948, isn't a single historical moment that we're now eager to rectify by implementing 194. Refugees are allowed to return, and this alleviates the situation. To the contrary, the condition of forced removal, dispossession, and displacement is an ongoing condition for Palestinians, where the project of settling the land is one that doesn't happen in a particular instance, but one that's continuing as part of Israel's settler-colonial expansion. And that's not simply, right? And even saying that in this context makes this difficult to even localize geographically, because if you think of 1948, we're thinking of, right? We're thinking of what today is Israel proper. And even this doesn't make much sense because Israel never declared its borders. So whereas these are the 1967 lines, or the armistice, the green line, right? The lines to establish the two-state solution. In fact, Israel's borders extend much farther into Gaza and to the West Bank, and they're very elusive. There are no borders. But when we think about the Palestinian refugee experience, we think about the Palestinians displaced from this, within the green line. And yet when you think about settler-colonial expansion today, right, with the proliferation of settlements, now suddenly our geographic imagination displaces into the West Bank, where settlements are expanding this way. And so you have removal of Palestinians from here and new refugee experiences. And in this entire narrative, of course, we have the erasure of 200,000 Palestinians who were forcibly displaced in 1967 during the Six-Day War. What I'm asserting is that all of this is constitutive of a single process and a single narrative that constitutes Israel's central premise of its own identity and its own constitution of being a state for Jewish people. But the way that one of Israel's founding fathers and two-time prime ministers imagined this is that it would be a state with an 80% majority Jewish persons. So an 80% majority of Jewish people in a land where there's already an indigenous, Muslim, Christian, Palestinian population is impossible. Unless that indigenous population is forcibly removed. And that's exactly what was done. I'm happy to read you quotes. I think I'm just gonna continue. But I'm happy to read you quotes for those who are in somewhat disbelief. It's not that shocking though, looking at this crowd. So it's impossible to have that demographic majority unless that population is forcibly displaced, which they were. But here's the other piece of it is how is that majority sustained given the natural population growth of Palestinians here within Israel proper, which will by 2025 outnumber their Jewish counterparts? And how do you maintain this demographic balance if Israel is not declaring its borders but expanding into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? One of the conundrums of Israel's project is that for its own purpose, to benefit itself and maintain this majority, it could have accepted the two-state solution and said, okay, these are our borders, we'll give you the two states, and the Palestinian Leadership Liberation Organization, the PLO, accepted this in 1988 as part of the two-state solution. Israel never does that which will benefit its own interest of maintaining a demographic majority, putting into question this idea of then what exactly is the purpose. But looking at maps and looking at the settler-colonial expansion not only happening in the West Bank, but also taking place throughout Israel proper, it becomes clear that there is no purpose of actually establishing a Palestinian state to maintain this demographic majority, because there's another project, and that project is one that seeks to diminish the Palestinian population, to concentrate the Palestinian population, and to erase Palestinian narrative, a historical narrative altogether. And so even memory becomes a threat. And this ongoing practice is one that happens through law, administrative practices like the application of retroactive taxes, so that those Palestinians living in Jerusalem who have been living there, who have never left, like Nour's friend, which she met when she was 9 years old and caused her an existential moment, that those living in Jerusalem, for example, will be slapped with a tax, a retroactive tax, that never existed. So here we have our concept of laws is you can't be accountable to a law that you didn't know existed. Well, for Palestinians in Jerusalem, they can be accountable to a tax that obligates them to pay 10 years of taxes retroactively that they never knew existed. Failure to pay those taxes means the revocation of their homes. And so you have this very bureaucratic, cold administrative process to remove Palestinians from their homes, which is just as devastating and just as dramatic and just as impactful as the forced removal of Palestinians in 1948, this mass exodus, and yet one that happens and becomes part of a daily experience. And so another example of this, and Nour, I'm sorry I didn't ask you about this before, but you've gone public with it, so I'll just share. Another example, and this is something that Nour and others have experienced, is those who are of Palestinian origin but do not have Palestinian documents and can arbitrarily be denied the right to enter. Indefinitely be denied the right to enter. Now that might seem like, well, it's every country's prerogative to deny somebody a visa to come and visit. But when you systematically deny those of Palestinian origin the right to enter, and to right to enter indefinitely without any form of recourse, suddenly this isn't just about a national prerogative to decide who comes into the country. This becomes about registering another refugee. I hope that's okay. Okay.
I had a visa for the record.
Oh yeah, that's right. I have a visa from the Ministry of Interior. Okay, so just a few stats on how this happens. Since just the most simple ways to continue this forced removal, between 1967 and 1994, Israel stripped 140,000 Palestinians of their West Bank residency rights. The Central Bureau of Statistics in Palestine says that but for this policy, the Palestinian population in the West Bank alone would be greater by 14%. And so we see this type of forced removal. Other examples include the and I'll go through this with other maps, but the settlement of the Jordan Valley of 30 distribution of water resources so that the Bedouin population in the Jordan Valley no longer has the means to produce goods in their own livelihoods and are also forcibly displaced. Their population has been reduced from 400,000 in 1967 to 56,000 today. And so we see this increasing, these statistics that continue within Israel itself. These statistics are also rampant, and I'll go through that. But one example is the ban on family reunification, which now Palestinians, or anybody, it's not specific, so this is how Israel creates its law. So on its face, all it says is that though if someone with Israeli citizenship, and that includes the 20% Palestinian population who never left, marries a Palestinian from an enemy state, that Palestinian they marry is not eligible for citizenship within Israel. Coincidentally, where do the enemy states happen to be? Anybody want to guess? Okay, check this out. The West Bank, Gaza Strip, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. Iran is somewhat of an outlier. But for the rest of those, this means that when a Palestinian from the Negev meets a Palestinian from Bethlehem, say in a conference in Jordan or at university in Canada, who fall in love and want to come back and build a family here, they're not allowed to do so as a matter of law. Now, Israel has said, the Israeli state has said that this is for security purposes because these Palestinians that live here are all suicide bombers waiting to blow themselves up. But that's a security proxy, as evidenced by the Israeli High Court Justice Michel Shashin, who says in the decision, right, that this is not a matter of love, but a matter of life and death for the Israeli state. And life and death meaning the preservation of a Jewish majority by any means possible. And more recently, this decision was upheld in January 2012, where the Supreme Court Justice literally said, we've been saved from a flood of Arab refugees. And so the explicit purpose for the ban on family reunification is evidenced. And so, but none of this is happening in the grotesque way that we remember as a result of war, but instead happens because of an architecture of settler-colonialism that's comprised of law, fiat, decree, and policy. So let me show you a map of, you know what this is? Well, I hope you can read. This is a map of Jerusalem. As you know, in 1967, when Israel established itself, East Jerusalem remained part of the West Bank, right? Israel formally annexes it in 1980 in contravention of international law, which has not been recognized by any country internationally, not even the United States, which has not moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Right? This is a long-standing contention. And this year in the U.S. Supreme Court, there was another battle over the same issue because Israelis wanted those who were born in Jerusalem to immediately have Israeli citizenship. I have to remember the exact Supreme Court case, but again, the U.S. followed its diplomatic line not to recognize Jerusalem as the United Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So this remains a strong point of contention. Notwithstanding even that diplomatic resistance in the U.S., the facts on the ground are different. Israel is steadily expanding its control of East Jerusalem as well, and is doing so very explicitly. Part of its 2000 Greater Jerusalem Municipal Plan is to reduce the ratio of Palestinians to Jewish Israelis within East Jerusalem from a balance of 60% to 40% to 70% to 30% by 2020. An explicit demographic goal to reduce the Palestinian population. Where exactly? In the areas surrounding West Jerusalem. So that includes Sheikh Jarrah, Aisawiyah, Silwan. It goes as far as parts of Al-Izariyah, bits of Al-Izariyah, and Abu Dis. This is where my family is from. We joke that we were spared forced displacement because the annexation or apartheid wall is built right here. It means our backyard is a wall that cuts off Palestinians economically from other Palestinians, from the hub of Jerusalem, right? But on the other hand, spared the pain of being driven out by settlers. Very explicitly, the people in Sheikh Jarrah, however, are not spared that, where 3,000 Palestinians are now at an explicit in a campaign specifically targeted to remove all of them, so that Israel can expand its borders and make it Jewish, for Jewish persons only. So this is not, at no point is there a goal for integration anywhere, but this goal of concentrating the Palestinian population in order to avoid integration is rampant. In one situation, in this situation, this is al-Kurd, a 92-year-old woman who was displaced from Haifa in 1948 and comes to live in Sheikh Jarrah because Jordan builds homes, housing for the Sheikh Jarrah residents in 1951, has been living there since then. So here, this is me, and there's a delegate. This is with the Interfaith Peace Builders. I co-led a delegation this summer. I encourage you all to do that on a 2-week program to see the facts on the ground. We were our trip was themed the impact of U.S. foreign policy in the region, because everybody in this room is part of the conflict, because we are all paying and subsidizing this settler-colonial expansion. Kurd has a home where she built an extension for it for her son and his family. On one particular night, a group of young Jewish Israeli settler boys, teenagers, came and settled in the house, in her house. So she now has to see them so her son can't live there, and every day they harass them, including they have a large dog that they pit on the family that has scared them if they try to protest. The settlers call the police and say that this family, the Kurd family, attacked them. They're then arrested and interrogated. There's absolutely no recourse for them. The only thing she can do is stay there. And that's what she's been trying to do. But with very, very little support for a little bit. There's been an international campaign, but even that international campaign has died down. 3 families have been removed from their home in this way, but have successfully removed the family altogether. In Kurd's situation, she remains there with her 2 daughters, resisting this. And I encourage you, if you visit the region and if you make it to Jerusalem, to visit the family, because every time someone actually visits, it's an act of solidarity as well, which is very aggravating to the settlers who have urinated on mats where activists who come to spend the night, for example, to offer protection because of their privilege, have stayed or spread their feces over different parts of their home. That's the situation in East Jerusalem, but that's part of a much larger project, and here again, the architecture of Israel's settler-colonial project. Israel seeks to be Jewish and democratic, right? It's the only democracy in the Middle East. They just leave off the fact that it's a democracy for Jewish persons only, which is a bit of a paradox because it doesn't seem very democratic. But that means 3 things. Jews have to maintain the majority of the state. I've touched on that. Jews are entitled to preferential treatment. Preferential treatment explicitly for being Jewish. And that democracy in the Middle East does not have a constitution. It has a set of basic laws, and one of its basic laws on human dignity and liberty, and by the way, that wasn't written until 1992, it says, this basic law shall not affect the validity of any law enforced prior to the commencement of the basic law. I don't know how many, I know Shafaq is a lawyer, but others who can, and I know Tariq is an attorney, so he can read through these lines as well. If this shall not affect the validity of any law enforced prior to the commencement, what it means is that all discriminatory laws that had previously been legislated, even if they've been, if they're discriminatory on their face, will not contravene the basic law on human dignity and liberty. Which laws actually did that? Several laws. And the cornerstone of this law is the citizenship law or nationality law of 1952. It, one, denationalized the Palestinian indigenous population. So the Palestinians, of course, Israel is established in a colonial moment where most states were either experiencing their decolonization or, like South Africa, was being colonized. And so the idea that Palestinians weren't a people anyway doesn't make sense. Nationalism is a 20th century concept. At the time in the establishment of the United Nations, for example, in 1945, there's only a handful of states. There's something like 45 states that existed in 1945. 193 states exist today. That leap in numbers represents all the states that were previously colonized that became decolonized. So this idea that Palestinians weren't a people makes no sense if you apply some sort of historical context and rigor. But Palestinians did have nationality from a 1925 order under the British Mandate, and they were denationalized in 1952 by this law. What this law also does is it creates two things. It creates a Jewish nationality, right? The law of return creates Jewish nationality, and the citizenship law and it basically bifurcates citizenship from nationality so that you have Jewish nationality on the one hand and Israeli citizenship on the other. If you're a Jewish national, you're immediately eligible to be an Israeli citizen. If you're an Israeli citizen, you're never eligible to be a Jewish national, right? So now you have a two-tiered system within the state itself of Jewish national plus Israeli citizenship, Israeli citizens only, and then if you get into the occupied territories, now you're talking about civilians under occupation, so statelessness, and if you talk about refugees, it's even less rights, right? Because at least in the West Bank and Gaza, you have some sort of documentation that you're entitled to a state. How does this work in practice? In practice, it operates in a very complicated yet systematic way, whereby there is no such thing as Israeli nationality. And recently in the Israeli High Court of Justice, or their equivalent to the Supreme Court, a group of Jewish Israelis filed a petition to be recognized as Israeli nationals in their effort to make non-Jewish persons also eligible, and the High Court of Justice refused to rule, saying this is not a question of law, this is a question of politics. So for politicians and society to decide, even though very much citizenship is a question of law, right? And so the reason for that is because nationality affords the rights to enter Israel at any time, to obtain citizenship at any time, to live anywhere in Israel or in the settlements, anywhere they want at any time, and not only to live in the settlements, but to have subsidized living, right? So that Jewish nationals living in Israel, Jewish nationals living in the occupied territory have the same rights. And Jewish nationals living abroad are eligible for that entire cacophony of rights. In contrast, you break down now Israeli citizenship. So now you have the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, very limited rights, to be distinguished from those who live in East Jerusalem, who only have residency rights. So they have an ID, a tenuous residency ID, that can be revoked at any time, as we've seen. It can be revoked for any reason. One of the laws that's now in place is something called the Center of Life Law. So residents of East Jerusalem have to establish that Jerusalem is their center of life for 7 consecutive years. If for any reason they study abroad, they marry and live somewhere else, they decide they want to spend 2 years in Paris, which will never happen, but okay, imagine. We'll spend 2 years in Paris getting an education or building a life with somebody, and then they can come back. If they do that, they risk their residency being revoked because of the Center of Life law. That's Jerusalem, and it's the site of the most aggressive ethnic cleansing today. So, again, citizens of Israel, there's 35 laws within Israel that explicitly discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of Israel or otherwise prioritize the rights of the Jewish national Israeli citizens and those who are citizenship is never available, and that includes Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who have zero rights, even their human rights are being contested. Palestinian West Bank ID holders who are subject to military law, and Palestinian refugees who are stateless persons. This matrix operates on a daily basis, and together it constitutes an apartheid structure, wherein we want to apply the 1973 UN General Assembly resolution that criminalizes apartheid as a crime against humanity. We can go through that legal analysis. I'll spare you that, and suffice it to say that the outcome is the domination of one group over another based on their ethnic or racial background, right? How does that operate in terms of the right of return for Palestinian refugees? It operates basically that the return only belongs to those who are Jewish nationals, which was established and captured in the law of return of 1950, which entitles Jewish nationals to entry and citizenship and defines Jewish nationals very exclusively, right? And then Palestinians who are non-Jewish nationals, who are refugees and might have privileges under the right of return or UN General Assembly Resolution 194, are not eligible. So then you have this you have this forcible exile. I mentioned tenuous identity in East Jerusalem, residency revocation. Between 1967 and 2010, 13,115 Palestinians were subject to silent deportation. Today, 55,000 Palestinians with Jerusalem residency who are on the wrong side of where the wall was built also have the residency at risk. Military Order 1650. If you're not familiar with this, it basically is the law that categorizes Palestinians as infiltrators in their own land, so that Palestinians from Gaza are no longer permitted to be in the West Bank. And if they're found, for example, like those students who had been studying in their junior year and were forcibly removed from the West Bank and returned to Gaza, right? This is at the behest of Military Order 1650. Significantly, and again this feeds into the idea of the two-state solution, the whole purpose is to create a civic and national polity between the West Bank and Gaza, and yet here you see this intense fragmentation and concentration of the Palestinian population that diminishes a singular national identity. What does this look like? Here you can see the wall, how it's working to concentrate the Palestinian population into certain areas, but it's also dividing them. So that Palestinians are divided from one another and divided from their farms and divided from their homes in ways that, the idea is that it was supposed to protect Israel from suicide bombings at the height of the Second Intifada, but in fact, the wall, you can see it, the red route. Here's the 1967, or the green line. The red line is the border of the wall. 85% of it runs in the West Bank. It works to confiscate an additional 13% of the West Bank. And everybody who's built on the wrong side of the wall is suddenly neither part of Israel or part of the future Palestinian something, right? And so that's how this law works. Now, obviously, a security proxy has been the most effective for Israel to continue this ethnic cleansing project. Value of terminology, the apartheid wall, the annexation wall. And 40% of the West Bank is declared a closed military zone. This is the Jordan Valley. Right? Here's Jericho. Jericho was one of the 9 cities that was declared an independent city in 1992 or 1993 when Oslo was signed, right? 9 cities, Jericho was one of them. Check this out. Jericho's little Bantustan. Everything surrounding it, because it's in the Jordan Valley, is pretty much an Israeli military zone. which Israel declares needs to be monitored by soldiers because this is at the border of Jordan and this presents a significant security risk if Palestinians control their own border. And so here's where we saw an intense amount of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population between 1967 and the present. I mentioned the amendment to the Citizenship and Entry Law. Let me talk a little bit about the Prior Plan. The Prior Plan seeks to forcibly remove the Palestinian citizens who live within the Nakba, or the south of Israel, also known as the Negev Desert, right? Who have been living there since 1948. Now they're refugees, they're internally displaced persons, excuse me, not refugees. The distinction between refugees and internally displaced persons is that both are forcibly removed. The refugee actually transgresses a border, an international border. The internally displaced person remains within the border, right? The Palestinian Bedouin population in the Negev are IDPs because in 1948 they were removed from their homes and they were put into the Negev, into what was called the Sayagh, literally the enclosed zone. These are townships, right? They just wanted to put all these Palestinians in one place. Now Israel wants to build a settlement, a Jewish-only settlement within Israel and plant a forest where these Palestinians live. And in order to do so, they've created a narrative that these Palestinians are infiltrators. And these are the Palestinians that they forcibly displaced and are documented in their master plans. And yet this is the way that new narratives are created. The advantage of al-Hiran, when Israel was established, in addition to removing 750,000 Palestinians from their original homes, 100 villages where Palestinians were either placed or remained became unrecognized, so that they were never connected to the electricity grid, water system, or part of the national planning, right? These unrecognized villages, like Hiran, have been fighting their displacement for 10 years. They have access to judicial recourse. Those Palestinians in the Negev who are subject now to the Prior Plan, about 40,000 to be forcibly removed, do not have access to judicial recourse. Instead, this is a law passed by the Knesset to forcibly remove them immediately and describing them as infiltrators. So what you're about to see is a best case scenario of a community that's been fighting back for a decade now. By the way, this narrative of the settler narrative that we want to come and make the desert bloom that ran throughout the settler interview, the reason that the Palestinians have not been able to make it bloom themselves in ways that they had previously is specifically because they're denied access to water. So there's an explicit program not only to prevent development, but to also encourage de-development. But the discourse of settlement is not just one in the occupied territory. And so if you look, that was this map, if I didn't tell you, you would think is probably, where would you think it is? Maybe you don't think it's anywhere. So I'll just tell you. These are Palestinian concentrations of Palestinians' population. The map, the master plan, Bedouin master plan, seeks to place them into these concentrations. This is in the Negev. This is within Israel. So even within the state itself, where Palestinians are already a minority, the plan is to do the same to them as it's doing in the occupied territory, where they're similarly, as is the plan, being concentrated into these areas. How are they being concentrated? Through that matrix of laws, whether it's by maldistribution of water, declaring something a military zone or a firing zone where Palestinians can't live, building a wall so that it has to take the land, forces Palestinians to move elsewhere, builds bypass roads so that the only way that you can actually make sure that your children get an education is to move into one of these areas so that they can reach school adequately. This is the steady movement of concentration. And it actually looks more dramatic if you look at it like this. So this is the West Bank. This is the Negev. And then the map looks similarly if you look at all of historic or mandate Palestine or Israel proper. Gaza is the largest of these concentrations. And they're the most severe because they're sealed under a complete naval blockade and land siege. So you have, it's the largest concentration in the plan in Gaza is actually to kind of make it its own floating entity that either will be absorbed by Egypt, which of course is not going to happen, Egypt doesn't want it, or that will become its own, right, Islamic Emirate, or just nobody wants Gaza. It doesn't become part of this plan. But I would say it's the biggest of these concentrations and these ghettos. And surrounding all these concentrations are Jewish neighborhoods and lands and Jewish-only roads if it's in the West Bank, or Israeli-only roads in the West Bank, and settlements. And that's the movement that we're moving towards, and this is not something that can be alleviated simply by a two-state solution, because obviously two-state solution has been destroyed. And even if we think about a one-state solution that does not address the core of the settler-colonial architecture will mean that Palestinians will be living in reservations in a one-state, right? So Israel will likely agree to a one-state solution so long as it can ensure the control and concentration of Palestinians, but this happens, it's control, concentration, and the diminishment of the population and an ongoing creation of a refugee population. How then, this is not to depress you, but how then do you counter this? And there's several ways to do it. One of the most powerful ways is even the assertion and the retelling and the sharing of Palestinian narratives. Because what's under attack is Palestinian identity altogether and Palestinian history. So even this idea of cultural programming is a political act of resistance, and one that affirms that Palestinians aren't a surplus population that's expendable, right? Another way, and one that obviously you can take part of, is part of what solidarity communities have been asked to do in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns. Because of the U.S.'s role, the U.S. is the primary financier of Israel, providing to it now approximately $103 to $115 billion since its establishment, more than all of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America combined. And all of us are paying for that. If you saw, so we all have a responsibility, if you saw on the Jewish settlement in Hiran, I don't know how many of you read, this was a gift of the JNF USA. The Jewish National Fund, which presents itself as an NGO in the US for environmental greening purposes, is the primary driver. It's the one that's supporting these projects and to build these forests where Palestinians live. The JNF has 501c3 status in the US, meaning, again, for the attorneys in the room, this is an opportunity to revoke its charitable tax code. It actually is, it's in violation of the IRS tax code. And as a result, the JNF and other organizations like it are beneficiaries of approximately $750 million US annually that is tax forgivable. So imagine just to revoke that tax status, that's $750 million less, nearly $1 billion less that would fund this. And this is things to be done in the US. Here on campus, there's a TIACREF campaign. We'll let others talk about it. And most recently, I don't know if you've noticed, I hope you have, but the American Studies Association became the second in, yes. Wow, I would hope you'd be more excited, or maybe people don't know. The American Studies Association is the second in the US, second academic American association that has endorsed the academic boycott of Israel. The first was the Asian American Studies Association, which endorsed it. This is more significant because it's bigger, it's 5,000 members, it's much more mainstream. I know I saw some people there. This is a historic victory, but it's not done yet, because the National Council of 20 has unanimously endorsed it, but now it's out to a membership vote amongst all ASA members. So if you want to make a difference between now and December 15th, right, all you need to do is talk to your professors, ask them to write letters to support the ASA resolution. You can go on to the ASA Facebook page and write comments in support. You can also write articles if you want and submit them to Mandawai's Electronic Intifada, Jadaliya, I'd be happy to help you. To create, this has also become somewhat of a major controversy. As you saw, there was an article by Michelle Goldberg in The Nation to which Judith Butler responded. The New York Times refused to cover the boycott, but published an op-ed by Stanley Fish in opposition to it. So this is also a critical moment, much beyond the boycott, but is a moment where we can enter into the mainstream discourse on this topic. So that's another way you can help. And of course, you know, anybody who is a faculty member of the ASA or a student member or a graduate student member, right? Get them to vote by December 15th to make sure that this is a victory we can at least keep in place. And beyond that, keep doing the work that you're doing. Thank you.